The morning my father-in-law called a family meeting, I knew something was wrong before I even sat down. It wasn't anything obvious. The coffee was made. The dining table was set the way Margaret always insisted. Placemats straight, chairs pushed in properly, a small candle burning in the center, even though it was barely 11 in the morning. But Franklin was standing at the window with his back to us, and in the 22 years I'd known that man, he had never once stood with his back to a room full of people. My husband Theo squeezed my hand under the table. His sister Dina was already there, arms crossed, eyes moving between her father and her brother, like she was trying to solve a math problem before anyone asked the question. Her husband Craig sat beside her, scrolling his phone in that performative way people do when they want to look unbothered. Franklin turned around. He was 67 years old, retired from 30 years in civil engineering, a man who had built his entire life around precision and order. He was not the kind of person who fumbled for words, but standing there that morning, he looked like someone who had rehearsed a speech 50 times and still wasn't sure he had it right. "I have something to tell you," he said, "and I need you to let me finish before anyone says anything." Nobody spoke. Even Craig put his phone down. "Her name is Paige. She's 23. We met 8 months ago, and last weekend, we got married at the courthouse in Barrie." The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room, the way water fills a sealed container. Total pressing, leaving no air. Dina broke it first. "You're joking." "I'm not, Dad." Theo's voice was quiet. "Careful. You've known her for 8 months? I know what you're going to say." "Do you?" Dina pushed her chair back from the table. "Because I don't even know what I'm going to say. I don't even. Dad, she's younger than me. She's younger than me by 2 years. Franklin didn't flinch. "I didn't ask for your approval. I'm telling you because you deserve to know." That was the moment I felt it. The specific cold that settles in your chest when you realize a conversation is not going to go the way anyone hoped. Theo kept his hand in mine, but I felt his grip tighten. "Where is she?" I asked. It was the most practical question I could think of. "She's at the house. She moved in 3 weeks ago." Dina made a sound I can only describe as someone being winded. 3 weeks. "She's been living in Mom's house for 3 weeks and you didn't say anything." "It's my house, Dina. It was Mom's house." Franklin's jaw tightened. "Your mother has been gone for 4 years. Nobody had an answer for that." He wasn't wrong. He had every legal and moral right to do exactly what he'd done. That didn't make it feel any less like the floor had dropped out from under all of us. We left that afternoon without meeting Paige. Franklin offered, but Dina said she needed time, and Theo backed her up. And I drove home in silence, while my husband stared at the passenger window, and I tried to think of something useful to say that wouldn't make it worse. I didn't find anything. The first time I met Paige was 3 Sundays later, at a dinner Franklin insisted on hosting. He called it an introduction, which struck me as a strange word for meeting your father-in-law's new wife. Introductions were for colleagues, for neighbors, not for the woman sleeping in the bedroom where your late mother-in-law once kept her reading chair and her gardening books. I told myself on the drive up to Barrie that I would be kind, that I would give her a fair chance, that none of this was necessarily her fault. She opened the door before we even knocked. She was small and fair-haired, with the kind of face that looks younger than it is even at 23. Wide eyes, careful smile, hands clasped together in front of her, like she was bracing for impact. She was wearing a gray cardigan over a floral dress, and she said, "Hi, come in, please," in a voice so soft I almost had to lean in to hear her. Dina shook her hand without smiling. Craig shook it too quickly. Theo said, "Nice to meet you," in his careful, neutral way. I shook her hand and said, "I'm Ivy, Theo's wife." She held my hand a beat longer than expected. "He talks about you," she said. "He says you're the sensible one." I didn't know whether to be flattered or unsettled. I filed it away. Dinner was roast chicken and roasted root vegetables, a classic Franklin meal. Nothing Paige had made herself, I could tell. She mostly sat quietly, answered direct questions in short sentences, kept her eyes on her plate more than on anyone else. She wasn't rude. She wasn't performatively sweet either. She was just contained, like someone who had made a decision to take up as little space as possible. At one point, Dina asked, with minimal subtlety, how she and Franklin had met. "Through friends," Paige said. "Whose friends?" "Mine." Dina waited for more. Paige didn't offer it. Franklin changed the subject. On the drive home, Theo said he thought she seemed okay. Dina texted me from her car that she thought the whole thing was deeply weird. Craig, I suspected, had already stopped thinking about it. I kept thinking about the way Paige had held my hand at the door, and the way she'd smiled. Not at everyone, but specifically at me, and the way her eyes had moved around the house like she was always checking something. The windows, the hallway, the staircase. I told myself I was looking for problems that weren't there. I kept telling myself that for about 3 more weeks. It started with the sound. Theo and I had come up to Barrie for the long weekend in October. Thanksgiving, which Franklin had always insisted on hosting even after Margaret died. The plan was to stay in the guest room Friday and Saturday night, have the big dinner Sunday, and drive back to Toronto Monday morning. Friday night was fine. Dinner was quiet but not tense. Paige helped clear the table without being asked. Franklin seemed relaxed in a way he hadn't been in years, actually. Lighter, almost. I noticed that, and it complicated. I woke up at 2:15 Saturday morning because the house was cold and I'd forgotten we were in a house where the thermostat got turned down overnight. I got up to use the bathroom and that's when I heard it. It was coming from the end of the hall. From the room Franklin and Paige shared. At first I thought it was a TV. Or a nightmare. Anyone's nightmare. But then I stopped moving and I stood in the dark hallway and I listened, and it wasn't a TV. It was a voice. Paige's voice. Low and urgent and desperate in a way that made my skin go tight. I couldn't make out words. Just the tone, the pitch, the shape of it. And then silence. I stood there for a long moment. Then I went back to bed. I didn't wake Theo. I told myself there was nothing to tell. The second night it happened again. 3 in the morning this time. Same sound, same quality of desperation. This time it went on longer, maybe 5 minutes. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, and my heart was doing something unpleasant and fast in my chest. In the morning, at breakfast, Paige looked tired. Not dramatically so. Just the way a person looks when they haven't slept properly. She poured coffee for everyone, and didn't say much, and laughed once, briefly, at something Franklin said about the weather. I watched her, the way you watch someone when you're trying to decide if you're seeing what you think you're seeing. I didn't say anything Saturday. I told myself I'd wait. Sunday night, after dinner, after the dishes, after Franklin had gone to sit in his study, Paige and I ended up alone in the kitchen for about 10 minutes. "Can I ask you something?" I said. She looked up from the counter she was wiping. Her face didn't change. "Sure, are you okay?" She looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I started to feel like I'd overstepped. Then she said, "Why do you ask?" "I heard you, both nights. I'm not trying to pry. I just wanted to ask directly." She set down the cloth. She turned to face me fully, and for a second I saw something move across her face that I couldn't name. Not fear exactly, something more complicated than fear. "I have bad dreams," she said. "Since as I was a kid, I talk in my sleep. Franklin knows." "Okay," I said. "Okay," she said back. And that was the end of it. Except it wasn't, because I went home Monday morning with a feeling sitting in my chest like a stone I couldn't shift. I didn't tell Theo about the sounds right away. I know that sounds strange. But Theo was already carrying a lot. The adjustment to his father's marriage, the ongoing tension with Dina, the regular stress of his job at the civil engineering firm, where, ironically, he'd followed his father. I didn't want to add something that might be nothing, but I started paying attention in a different way after that weekend. Small things. Paige never called Franklin by his name. Not once. She said he and him and sometimes your father when talking to Theo, but never Franklin. I don't know why that struck me, but it did. She had no social media presence that I could find. That's not unusual. Plenty of people don't. But I noticed because I'd looked, the way you look for someone when you're trying to get a fuller picture of them. There was nothing. No Facebook, no Instagram, nothing under her name. I tried Paige and Franklin's last name too. Still nothing. She didn't have a job, as far as I could tell. When I asked Franklin once, casually, he said she'd left a job in Sudbury before they moved in together and was taking some time. He said it in the tone of someone who considers the subject closed. She didn't have friends visit, didn't mention family. Once, when I asked if her parents were local, she said they were in BC and left it at that. None of these things are crimes. I knew that. I kept reminding myself of that. But then came November. Theo's birthday is November 9th. We drove up to Barrie on the 8th, a Saturday, planning to take Franklin out for dinner and come back Sunday. Straightforward weekend. Low stakes. We got there around 4 in the afternoon. Franklin's car was in the driveway. The lights in the front room were on. Theo knocked. No answer. He tried the door, unlocked, and we went in. "Dad?" he called. Nothing. We went through to the kitchen. Signs of recent activity. A kettle that was still warm, 2 mugs on the counter, coats on the hooks by the back door. Everything looked ordinary. We figured they were in the backyard maybe, or in the garage. Theo went to check. I stood in the kitchen and that was when I noticed it. The door at the end of the first floor hallway. Franklin's old study, which he'd converted into a bedroom annex when his knees started bothering him. That door was closed. That door was never closed. Franklin never closed that door. He said closed doors in a house made him feel like he was in an institution. I walked toward it. I put my ear against it. Nothing. And then, very quietly, so quiet I wasn't sure I was actually hearing it, a sound, high and strained, like someone trying to keep their voice down, but not quite managing. I knocked. Paige? Franklin? Silence. I knocked harder. Hello? Is everyone okay in there? Nothing. Then, a muffled sound. Something moving against the floor. I went to get Theo. He came in from the garage, took one look at my face, and didn't ask questions. He knocked on the door himself, harder than I had, called his father's name twice. Nothing. Something's wrong, I said. He looked at me. Then he looked at the door. Then he took a step back and he put his shoulder into it. The lock held for one hit. On the second it gave. What we found was not what I'd feared. Franklin was sitting in the armchair in the corner of the room, his face gray and his hand pressed against his chest. He looked up at us with an expression I can only describe as relief cut through with profound embarrassment. Paige was kneeling on the floor next to him, her phone in her hand. She'd been calling 911. We'd knocked just as the call connected. His heart, she said. He said it started about an hour ago. He wouldn't let me call until. He kept saying he was fine. He kept saying to wait. Dad. Theo was already across the room. Dad, why didn't you? I didn't want to make a fuss, Franklin said. His voice was thin in a way I'd never heard before. It's probably nothing. It's probably nothing, Theo repeated, and his voice cracked in the middle of it. The ambulance was there in 9 minutes. I know because I counted. At the hospital, while Theo was with Franklin in the ER and I was sitting in a plastic chair in the waiting room with a terrible coffee, Paige sat down next to me. We didn't talk for a while. Just sat. Then she said he didn't want you to know. I looked at her. His heart. He's been having episodes for about 6 months. He made me promise not to say anything. She kept her eyes forward, not looking at me. That's why he married me at the courthouse. Quickly. He didn't want a big thing. He didn't want anyone fussing, but he said he needed someone there. In the house. In case. I felt something rearrange itself in my chest. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It's manageable, but it's serious. His cardiologist in Barrie is Dr. Osi. He's been on medication since May. And you? I stopped. How do you know Franklin? Really? She was quiet for a moment. Then, my grandmother was his colleague. Before she retired, he was kind to her when she got sick. When she died last year, he reached out to give his condolences. We started talking. He was. She paused. He was easier to talk to than most people. The sounds at night, I said. She looked at me then, direct, clear-eyed. He has episodes in his sleep sometimes. His heart rate spikes. He doesn't always, and it's happening, but I do. I stay awake. I monitor him. She looked back at the wall. I know how that sounds. It sounded like a 23-year-old woman who had given up her job and her life in Sudbury to move to Barrie to quietly care for an elderly man who didn't want his children to know he was sick. Why? I asked. Why didn't he just tell us? Paige's jaw worked for a moment. He said, and I know this is going to be hard to hear, he said he was afraid that if he told you, you'd spend whatever time was left looking at him differently. He wanted to just be your dad. For as long as he could. I didn't say anything for a long time. The terrible coffee went cold in my hands. He should have told us, I finally said. I know, she said. I told him that too. A lot. Theo came out 40 minutes later. Franklin had had a moderate cardiac event, serious enough to need monitoring overnight, not serious enough to require emergency surgery. His cardiologist was already in contact with the hospital. He was stable. Theo sat down next to me and put his face in his hands. I looked at Paige over his shoulder. She gave me a small nod. Go ahead. And I put my arm around my husband and I told him everything she'd told me. It took a long time. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he sat very still. Then he said he should have told us. I know. We would have. He stopped. We could have helped Top. I know. He was quiet for another moment. Then he looked at Paige. She met his eyes steadily, that same quality of bracing for impact that she'd had when she opened the door for the first time, but steadier now, more grounded. Thank you, Theo said. For being there. For staying. Something in her face shifted. Not quite relief. Something quieter than that. He made it easy, she said. He's a good person. Dina drove up from Toronto that night. Craig stayed home with the kids. She arrived at the hospital at 11:15, walked into the waiting room, saw Paige, stopped walking. I was the one who told her. She listened. She didn't interrupt either. When I finished, she sat down on the plastic chair, and she was quiet for so long I started to worry. Then she said, "He's so stubborn." "Yes," I said. "He's so. Why does he think we can't handle things? Why does he always do this? He thinks he's protecting everyone, and he's actually just." She pressed her fingers against her eyes. "He's been sick since April, and he didn't say anything." "He was scared," Paige said gently. Dina looked at her. It was the first time, I think, she'd really looked at her. Not with assessment or suspicion. Just looked. "He talks about you both constantly," Paige said. "About how proud he is. He has photos of your kids all over his study. He has the engineering award Theo won in 2019 on his bookshelf, like it's a trophy from the Stanley Cup." She paused. "He loves you. He didn't know how to be sick in front of people he loves." Dinah made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry. "That is the most Franklin thing I've ever heard," she said. Franklin came home 3 days later with a revised medication plan, a referral to a specialist at Toronto General, and strict instructions about diet and stress. He also came home with the information that his children now knew everything. Because Paige had told me, and I'd told Theo, and Theo had told his father, quietly and firmly, sitting next to his hospital bed on Sunday morning, that the secret was out. Franklin's response, according to Theo, was to stare at the ceiling for about 30 seconds, and then say, "Well, I suppose that's that." The first Sunday dinner we all had together after he came home, the 5 of us around his dining table, placemats straight, the candle in the center, was different from any that had come before. Not easier, exactly, but more honest. Franklin talked about his diagnosis for the first time out loud. He talked about what the next few months would look like. He asked Theo about his work in a way that invited a real answer instead of a polite one. At one point, Dina asked Paige how she took her coffee. Paige said black, no sugar. Dina said that was wrong, that coffee needed at least a bit of something, and Paige said with mild but clear conviction that she respectfully disagreed. And Dina laughed. Really laughed. Startled into it. And something in the room shifted that I don't quite have the words for. I don't want to make this into something neater than it is. There are still hard days. Dina still finds the marriage strange and probably always will. Craig still sometimes checks his phone at the table. Franklin still tries to minimize things when they get complicated, and Theo still has to push back gently to get the truth out of him. But here is what I know now. Paige is not what any of us thought she was. She is not naive, and she is not lost, and she is not taking advantage of anyone. She is a young woman who met an old man who reminded her of someone she loved, and she decided to stay. She gave up a lot to be there, in that house, quietly watching over him at 3 a.m. while the rest of us slept in our Toronto apartments and didn't know to worry. And Franklin, stubborn, proud, precise Franklin who spent 30 years building things designed to last, had tried to protect his children from his own mortality the only way he knew how. By handling it alone, by keeping it orderly, by not making a fuss. He was wrong to do it that way. We've told him so. He's heard us. But I understand it now, in a way I didn't that first morning, when he stood at the window with his back to the room and told us something that changed everything we thought we knew. He wasn't hiding Paige from us. He was hiding his fear. And the most important thing I can tell you, the thing I keep coming back to, is that we almost didn't get to tell him that it was okay, that we could handle it. That he didn't have to be anything other than exactly who he was. The door at the end of the hall is open now. Franklin's orders. He says it makes the house feel like a home again. I think he's right.